Welcome to this program in the Our Finger Lakes History series. I am Seneca County historian Walter Gable. It was on November 6, 1917, that women in New York State secured full suffrage. So we are celebrating the bicentennial of women's suffrage in New York State in this program. However, before we can seriously deal with the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, we need to have a good idea of the status of women's suffrage prior to 1848. Abigail Adams in 1776 was pressuring John Adams to fight for women's rights at the Second Continental Congress. John Adams saw Abigail as asking for more rights for women as a laughable matter, and derisively replied with the suggestion that women were going to take over and rule this country. However, states allowed women to vote at first, but then took that right away. New York State, for example, deprived women with property whose husbands had died of the right to vote in 1777. By 1787, women in all states except New Jersey had lost the right to vote. Now, a prevailing attitude at this time was the cult of domesticity. This was especially true among the upper and middle classes. The true women were supposed to possess 4 cardinal virtues: piety, purity, domesticity, and submissiveness. The women and men who most actively promoted these standards were generally white, Protestant, and lived in New England and the northeastern United States. This cult of domesticity revolved around the idea that women were the center of the family. Women were considered the light of the home. In 1777, when a new New York State Constitution was adopted, all women lost the right to vote in this state. If you look at this map, you will note that New York State in 1777 is quite different from the New York State of today. At the 1787 U.S. Constitutional Convention, the matter of women's suffrage was left to the states, all of which except New Jersey had already banned women's suffrage. Olympe de Gouges wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Women and Citizens during the French Revolution, a revolution that early on had adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. In 1792, Mary Wollstonecraft argued that women ought to have an education commensurate with their position in society, claiming that women are essential to the nation because they educate its children and because they could be companions to their husband rather than mere wives. Instead of viewing women as ornaments to society or property to be traded in marriage, Wollstonecraft maintains that women are human beings, deserving of the same fundamental rights as men. As indicated, in 1807, New Jersey was the last state to revoke woman suffrage. The involvement of women in anti-slavery efforts will be crucial to the women's rights movement. I personally would go so far as to say that there may well have not been a women's rights movement had there not been an anti-slavery movement. And I say that for 2 reasons. First, the involvement of women in the anti-slavery movement leads women to learn the necessary skills to organize and run their own movement successfully. Second, the involvement of women in the anti-slavery movement raised their consciousness of how women were being treated inequitably by men. In 1840, the World Anti-Slavery Convention was held in London, and it was very momentous in 2 ways. First, Female delegates from the various U.S. anti-slavery associations were not seated as delegates. One of those was Lucretia Mott. A second factor, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton became friends there and vowed to do something about the inferior status of women once they got back to the United States and got settled. Although I don't have the time to trace the long-rooted origins of the belief that women should have the right to vote, I do want to point out some important developments prior to the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, showing how there were efforts being made to secure woman suffrage before that July 1848 convention. You will note in this time frame line that there were efforts to get the New York State legislature to pass laws protecting women's rights, for women's suffrage as well as the right of married women to own property, rather than her property holdings going to the new husband. The Liberty Party in May of 1848 called for full women's suffrage. The party's nominee for president was Gerrit Smith, the first cousin of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Now, I hope that you all know that the Seneca Falls is recognized as the site of the first Women's Rights Convention, and it is seen as the birth of the women's rights movement. Now, in the recent years, Seneca Falls is receiving a great deal of comment. President Obama referred to the Seneca Falls Convention, to Seneca Falls in his second inaugural address in January 2016. Maybe this notoriety helps to explain why the Women's Rights National Historical Park comments that its numbers of visitors doubled in summer 2016 compared to the summer of 2015, and they have had markedly increased numbers so far in 2017. Now, a question I get asked as county historian is, why did this Women's Rights Convention happen in Seneca Falls? I don't think you can give a definitive answer to that question, but there are some obvious contributing factors. Seneca Falls in the summer of 1848 had the Cayuga-Seneca Canal that connected with the Erie Canal, and at that time all trains going west to Buffalo from Albany passed through Seneca Falls. Seneca Falls and Waterloo were part of the fastest growing areas of the United States in the 1840s, both in terms of economic development and population. Seneca Falls was part of the burned-over district, which I'll be talking about in a separate slide. And of course, the role of certain key individuals and groups, a key individual being Elizabeth Cady Stanton. That has to be recognized. Now, to look at this aspect of the fact that Seneca Falls was part of the burned-over district arising in the Second Great Awakening of the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. It was a religious revivalism concentrated in western New York State. The religious revivalism of this burned-over district led to an outpouring of religious and social reforms. You will note that Seneca County and Seneca Falls is the eastern part of this burned-over district. These reform movements grew out of the Second Great Awakening's premise that man could determine right from wrong and would want to do what is right and avoid wrong. Closely associated with that religious premise was the conclusion that where there are wrongs in society, those wrongs must be corrected. The key reform was probably abolitionism, or the anti-slavery movement. Going on to the next slide, I am only going to speak about this aspect of the anti-slavery movement, the formation of the Free Soil Party. The newspaper meeting notice shown here had the names of several prominent area men. Jacob Chamberlain, J. Cowing, for example. The same summer of the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention, there were several meetings of the local Free Soil Party in Seneca Falls. Mexico's defeat in the Mexican War led to Mexico giving much territory to the United States, the so-called Mexican Cession. Anti-slavery people in the North were afraid that these Mexican cession lands could become slave states of the Union, and the Free Soil Party was formed, determined to stop that from happening. You will note that over 69% of the signers of the Declaration of Sentiments at the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls came from households affiliated with these Free Soil Party meetings. I stated from the households that way because women were not putting their names, obviously, to Free Soil Party meetings because women couldn't vote, but their husbands could. So women, of course, were signers at the Women's Rights Movement's Declaration of Sentiments. It's probably safe to say that there wouldn't have been this first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls in 1848 had it not been for the influence of both Henry and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The Stanton family had moved from Boston to Seneca Falls in 1847. Elizabeth found life in Seneca Falls very unfulfilling compared to the active social and political society she had so enjoyed in Boston. Henry was very involved in anti-slavery efforts. Henry supported Elizabeth's involvement in various reforms, including anti-slavery, temperance, and then women's rights. Quakers were very important for this Seneca Falls Convention. Quakers believed that men were equal to women. Quakers were very much involved in various reform movements, such as anti-slavery activity. Now, it was at the Hunt House in Waterloo that 5 ladies decided to call a women's rights convention on Sunday, July 9th. I use that date of Sunday, July 9th, rather than many sources which erroneously use the date of July 13th. The picture at the left shows how the house looks today, while the picture at right shows how that same house looked about 1855. Shown in this next slide are the 5 ladies that gathered on July 9th and decided to call that first Women's Rights Convention. All but Elizabeth Cady Stanton were Quakers. I add that Margaret Mead quote at the bottom to emphasize the importance of a small group planning such a world-shattering event. This is the notice that appeared in the Seneca County Courier. At right is shown in larger print the actual wording of the newspaper article. You will note that because the notice first appeared in this newspaper on July 11th, the date of July 13th that many sources use for this gathering at the Hunt House cannot possibly be correct. On Sunday, July 16th, 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton went to the McClintock House shown here in Waterloo to prepare the draft Declaration of Sentiments and the 11 resolutions that Stanton wanted adopted at the upcoming convention. This was the first that anyone learned that Stanton was going to present a resolution calling for full suffrage for women. Shown besides the McClintock House is the table over which Elizabeth Cady Stanton and some of the McClintock ladies reviewed Stanton's first draft of the Declaration of Sentiments and the 11 sentiments, including woman suffrage. This is the Wesleyan Chapel as it looks today. It was chosen as the meeting site because the congregation graciously opened its doors on many occasions for any reform group to meet in their chapel. I would add that this Wesleyan Chapel was on the western edge of the village of Seneca Falls when the chapel was constructed in 1843 as one of the many come-outer churches of the burned-over district. The convention was held on 2 days, but only women attended the convention on the first day. The only real controversy at this 2-day event was the resolution in which Stanton called for full suffrage for women. 69 women signed the Declaration of Sentiments, and 32 men were allowed to sign support on a separate sheet of paper. Here you see an alphabetical listing of the women and the men who signed the Declaration of Sentiments. At right, you see some comments about those who signed. You see the Quaker influence and clearly the influence of the Free Soil Party households. Now, what was the reaction to this Seneca Falls convention? Milliken, who was the editor of the Seneca County Courier, was actually a signer. The New York Herald commented about free publicity, and that seems to have a 2016 presidential election ring to it. Now, you have to remember that this 1848 convention came just a few years after the telegraph came into widespread use. So therefore, news is now traveling much faster. Going on to some other newspaper reactions, Elizabeth Cady Stanton seemed kind of shocked when she realized that many newspaper editors were reacting negatively to this convention. However, Horace Greeley of the New York Tribune was fortuitous in his position. He said that if Americans really believe in this idea that all men are created equal, they must endorse even the right of women to vote. However unwise and mistaken this demand, it is but the assertion of a natural right, and such must be conceded. How fortuitous. Now, we have one historian, Timothy Terpstra, and he's shown that perhaps it's a misconception that's been reported for many years that the overwhelming response of newspaper editors to the convention in Seneca Falls was negative. He shows that there were negative responses, yes, but there were also positive responses, as well as neutral responses. However, it is clear that Elizabeth Cady Stanton's father feared that his daughter had gone insane, and he rushed to Seneca Falls to see if that was really true. Now, Dr. Judith Wellman, who in her book, The Road to Seneca Falls, wrote that the Seneca Falls Convention actually energized Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Shortly after the Seneca Falls Convention of July 19th and 20th, 1848, there was another women's rights convention in Rochester. And then there were other locally attended conventions. In 1850, the first National Women's Rights Convention was held in Worcester, Massachusetts. Now, I'm emphasizing that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony did not meet each other until May 12th of 1851. I have included here some information about Emily Collins of South Bristol, a small rural hamlet near the south end of Canandaigua Lake. What Emily Collins did in her neighborhood when she heard about the Seneca Falls Convention illustrates how the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention did directly lead to other communities undertaking more enthusiastically whatever they could do to promote women's rights. The Seneca Falls Convention led to a women's rights convention being held in Penn Yan in 1855 in this Wesleyan church. Susan B. Anthony spoke at this convention in Penn Yan, and she argued that women should have the right to vote, using the principle that taxation without representation is tyranny. The main speaker at that convention was Ernestine Rose, a Polish Jewish immigrant who became a major women's rights activist. We all know that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony became the great working pair in the women's rights movement. As I've said, they did not meet each other until May 12, 1851, and shown at the top in this frame is the statue in Seneca Falls that portrays that meeting at which Amelia Jenks Bloomer introduced Anthony to Stanton. In addition to working on women's rights issues, Anthony and Stanton were very active in temperance causes. Now, national women's rights conventions were held annually from 1850 until the Civil War. Shown here are some other women who were activists in the women's rights movement before the Civil War. This frame shows how Stanton and Anthony were both involved in the temperance movement at the same time they're promoting the cause of women's rights. The outbreak of the Civil War forced Stanton and Anthony to put their women's rights crusade efforts on hold. Instead, they organized a Women's Loyal National League. This Women's Loyal League, however, during the Civil War had some positive results for women's rights efforts after the war. I say that because it drew in new young women, and it provided them with opportunities to learn important leadership skills. Right after the Civil War, Stanton and Anthony and others, including Frederick Douglass, organized the American Equal Rights Association to promote equal rights for all. The American Equal Rights Association had a divisive split arise when Congress proposed the 15th Amendment. Many female activists in the AERA would not support the 15th Amendment because it didn't also provide for female suffrage. So in 1869, we have the establishment of two women's rights groups, the National Woman's Suffrage Association of Stanton and Anthony, and the rival American Woman's Suffrage Association. This split, as Lincoln alluded to in his famous comment, "A house divided against itself cannot stand," that split made the struggle for women's rights more difficult. These two rival women's rights organizations differed on the approach to secure full women's suffrage. The NWSA favored securing a federal constitutional amendment, while the AWSA favored securing women's suffrage on a state-by-state basis. Some women's rights activists also favored creating a test case to get the U.S. Supreme Court to rule that wording in the 14th Amendment actually guarantees full women's suffrage. In 1872, Victoria Woodhull was a candidate for President of the United States. In 1890, the rival NWSA and AWSA merged to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association as a united, single national women's suffrage organization. Now, I've talked about the AERA. Let's look at it specifically in terms of what was happening in New York State. It had two major goals. One was to convince the 1867 New York State Constitutional Convention delegates that you need to remove the word male from the New York State Constitution and thus give women suffrage. Lucy Stone actively lobbied New York State Constitutional Convention delegates to include full woman suffrage and other women's rights, but without success. In this next frame, you see how various Western states granted women's suffrage prior to the start of World War I. Of course, Wyoming Territory in 1869 had granted full suffrage to women. You also see the Jeanette Rankin of Montana became the first woman to serve in Congress in 1916. Of course, she is the only member of Congress who voted against U.S. entry in both World War I and World War II. Now, to focus on Wyoming, Esther Morris is probably the female most responsible and probably the person most responsible for securing women's suffrage in Wyoming Territory. And she was born near Owego, New York. In 1870, she was the first female to hold a judicial position in the United States. Her statue is one of two that the state of Wyoming has in Statuary Hall in the U.S. Capitol. I think she should be nominated for induction into the National Women's Hall of Fame. As I had indicated earlier, one strategy in the women's rights movement was to create a test case that could go to the U.S. Supreme Court and have that court rule that wording of the 14th Amendment to the federal Constitution should be interpreted to guarantee women's suffrage rights because they are citizens. The 1872 national elections provided an opportunity for such a test case. Susan B. Anthony and other Rochester ladies voted in the 1872 elections. The Susan B. Anthony trial that results from that has become a rather famous event. It appears that Susan B. Anthony knew she would be arrested for illegally voting, and she was hoping it would become the basis for such a test case to the Supreme Court. Now, the next frame shows that on the same day Susan B. Anthony voted illegally, that was November 5th, 1872, that night she wrote a letter to Elizabeth Cady Stanton indicating what she was up to. She expected to be arrested and wanted to raise the issue of supremacy of national law over state actions. Notice that she says in her letter, well, I have been and gone and done it. Positively voted. Other ladies voted, but only Susan B. Anthony was arrested. When they came to her house to arrest her, she says, what's the normal procedure for when you arrest someone? Well, we handcuff the person. So Susan B. Anthony insisted that she be handcuffed. This trial has several interesting developments. She wouldn't post bail, but unfortunately her main lawyer did. And in the process, it deprived her of that possible appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court on the writ of habeas corpus issue. After being indicted, she spoke in all 29 post office districts in Monroe County, making it almost impossible to secure an impartial jury for her trial in that county of Monroe. So the trial was moved to Onondaga County to the Ontario County to the Canandaigua courthouse. And before that trial, she spoke for 21 consecutive days in various places in Ontario County in an effort to prejudice possible jurors. The trial was held in the Canandaigua courthouse. It appears that Judge Hunt, who presided over the trial, had already prepared his written verdict of instructions to the jury before the trial took place. In it, he directed that the jury would have to find her guilty. After she was convicted, Anthony was finally given a chance to speak. She spoke at length, with the judge being unable to stop her until she was finished. She was fined $100, but she refused to pay any of it, so the judge wouldn't take further action until the fine was paid, and that deprived her of the right to appeal to a higher court. Shown here is a picture of the North Courtroom of the Ontario Courthouse in Canandaigua as it looks today. This is where the Anthony trial took place. Going on, Anthony never paid her fine. The federal government never made any effort to collect it. She cleverly had 3,000 copies of the trial proceedings distributed to libraries and other places throughout the continent. And I love this comment by one newspaper: "If it is a mere question of who got the best of it, Miss Anthony is still ahead. She has voted, and the American Constitution has survived the shock. Fining her $100 does not rule out the fact that women voted and went home, and the world jogged on as before." To finish this aspect, in 1875, in the case Minor versus Happersett, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that women could only receive the vote as a result of explicit legislation or constitutional amendment, rather than through interpretations of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. This ruling made it clear that the focus of the women's suffrage movement thereafter had to be securing state-by-state legislative action or a full amendment to the U.S. Constitution. With the possibility gone of having the Supreme Court of the United States interpret the 14th Amendment wording, many women's suffragists were back to securing a federal constitutional amendment. It was in 1878 that the U.S. Constitution first began to consider adopting a woman's suffrage amendment. It was introduced by Senator Sargent of California. There were 28 words to that simple goal: a federal constitutional amendment providing for women's suffrage. Now, to get back to some specific developments in New York State, starting in 1876, there were serious efforts to get the New York State legislature to amend the state constitution so as to provide for women's suffrage. Unsuccessful in securing full suffrage for women, in 1880 there was adoption of so-called partial suffrage, when women were given the right to vote in school elections. When 13 women voted in Syracuse in February 18, 1880, it was the first time since 1777 that any women in New York State had voted legally. Shown in this frame are some types of partial suffrage that women in various states were obtaining at this time. They could vote for school budgets, for school board member elections, or they might be able to vote for village or town or municipal elections. They might be able to vote in party primary elections, but not the general election in November. Or they might be able to vote only in the presidential election and not for other elections in the general election in November. Going on, having received the right to vote in school elections in 1880, women were gradually given additional aspects of partial suffrage in New York State prior to 1915. As I said earlier, in 1890, the two rival women's suffrage organizations on the national scene merged to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Although initially the AWSA had been the larger of the two organizations, the NWSA in 1880s had become the perceived main representative of the women's suffrage movement, and Susan B. Anthony was increasingly recognized as a person of political importance. Why did the two groups merge? I think the major factor is the realization that the United States had changed by 1890 from what it was in 1848, and also the U.S. Senate's rejection in 1887 of a proposed federal constitutional amendment. There may have been a merger of the two rival women's suffrage organizations, but there were still major differences of opinion. Not all women's suffragists embraced Stanton's radicalism, especially when she published her new book, The Woman's Bible. And not all women suffragists embraced Henry Blackwell's Southern strategy, which I won't take the time to explain. In 1900, Carrie Chapman Catt became president of this organization, and she implemented a society plan of recruiting wealthy members of the growing women's club movement for the women's suffrage crusade. She stepped down when her husband became ill. Another key player on the national scene was Harriet Blanche, a daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Her women's political union movement brought working class women into the women's suffrage movement. And with more and more women working, this was a very important development. Going on, black women became increasingly involved in the women's suffrage movement in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and that's a crucial addition to the cause. In this 1911 map, you see that women's suffrage, be it full women's suffrage or only partial suffrage, was extensively true in the West, but not very true east of the Mississippi River. Do note, however, that New York and some other eastern states have extended some form of partial suffrage by 1911. Another key player on the national scene was Alice Paul. She was a Quaker and one of the most highly educated women in the United States at that time. And she was willing to use more militant social disobedience tactics to secure women's suffrage. She planned the famous Women's Suffrage Parade in Washington, D.C., the day before Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated as President of the United States in 1913. And we'll take a look at that famous event. This slide shows that the parade was a marvelous mass procession of women's suffragists down Pennsylvania Avenue from the U.S. Capitol to the White House, led by Inez Mulholland dressed in white on a white horse. As the procession continued, however, you see in this picture the paraders passing the Treasury building with the Capitol in the very back. Lots of people. The parade got out of hand. Here you see the mobs of people taking to the street and disrupting the forward movement of the paraders. Quickly, the parade became a mob scene. The police were accused of doing nothing to protect the women marchers from the rioters. There were accounts that Boy Scouts stepped in to provide first aid to the injured. Note the Women's Journal headline, "Parade Struggles to Victory Despite Disgraceful Scenes." The widespread publicity of the incident helped to mobilize public dialogue on the women's suffrage issue. Because the national organization felt that Alice Paul was moving too aggressively, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns formed the Congressional Union. Harriet Stanton Blanche's political union merged with the Congressional Union and became the National Women's Party, which had the priority of securing a federal constitutional amendment and was willing to use confrontational tactics to achieve that. Now, don't think for a moment that every woman favored women's suffrage. And of course, many men opposed women's suffrage. There was a strong anti-suffrage movement in New York State, which was the subject of Susan Goodyear's 2013 book, No Votes for Women. Typical anti-suffrage women were white and often very wealthy. The national anti-suffrage movement was based in New York City. The suffragist movement tried to link the anti-suffragist movement with the liquor interests. Remember that temperance activism was very strong at this time and would result in the proposed 18th Amendment in December 1917. Here are a couple of examples of the tactics and goals of the anti-suffrage movement. The use of emotionalism was very common on both sides of this issue. And here are a couple of more examples. Why did the anti-suffragists say, don't give women the right to vote? One of their main arguments is that most of the women at this time didn't want it, or didn't think it was important at least. But meanwhile, the suffragist efforts continued. Here you see a poster for a women's suffrage convention in Geneva in 1897. You also see at the top right some of the sheet music expressing the suffragist cause. You also see as posters stating 12 reasons why women should vote. Now, to focus specifically on securing women's suffrage in New York State by amending the state constitution, it was basically a very simple concept. Remove the word male from Article 2, Section 1 of the state constitution, and women would have the right to vote. The process, however, was much more difficult. It is not an easy process to amend the Constitution. But both suffragists and anti-suffragists realized that if New York State were to give women the right to vote, it would be crucial to other states just simply following in line. Now, you need to remember, of course, it's going to be only men that will be voting to propose a constitutional amendment to the state constitution to give women the right to vote. Now, to focus on some developments in the New York State crusade. Amending the New York State Constitution, as I said, is not a simple task. Virtually everyone for or against female suffrage realized that New York State would be a milestone in the national women's suffrage effort if women in New York got the right to vote. Every New York State legislature from 1897 until 1915 considered proposing to the voters an amendment to the New York State Constitution providing for women's suffrage. Finally, in 1915, they actually voted to propose that amendment. This October 23rd, 1915 parade shown here in New York City was the largest parade in New York City's history up to that point. Now, the amendment is going to the voters in November 1915. There's a lot of momentum to give women the right to vote. Remember, it's going to be male voters only that are going to have to approve that. But don't think that everything was rosy. Look at this. The New York Times opposed the passage of this 1915 referendum, feeling it would play havoc for themselves and society. What happened on November 2nd, 1915, the general election? This referendum was not approved. But neither did women's suffrage proposals pass that year in the 3 neighboring states of New York. There were several defeats in the efforts to secure women's suffrage state by state between 1898 and 1916, but nevertheless the suffragists persisted in their efforts. As the cartoon shown in this slide, the national suffrage movement was gaining despite some unsettling setbacks. It's the last few buttons that are always the hardest. The women's suffrage movement is going to receive some very important impetus from the fact that the United States entered World War I. Now, as I said earlier, Alice Paul was willing to use confrontational tactics to secure women's suffrage. She saw a wonderful opportunity on December 2nd, 1916. There was going to be this major flotilla of boats down the Hudson River through New York City to the Statue of Liberty, where the lights would come on for an electrified Statue of Liberty for the first time. President Wilson, who opposed women's suffrage, and he had his own yacht as part of that flotilla. And Alice Paul was willing to embarrass President Wilson. What she did was she organized biplanes piloted by female pilots to fly over the flotilla of ships, drop leaflets on all of the flotilla of ships, including President Wilson's yacht, saying women should have the right to vote. Another way she tried to organize and use confrontational tactics, in January 1917, she began to organize a series of protests along the fence outside the White House. The suffragists that were in this protest were known as silent sentinels or sentinels of liberty. They also carried and held signs. And one of the signs showed President Wilson being characterized as the equivalent of the Kaiser of Germany because he opposed women's suffrage. The New York State Legislature in 1917 proposed another vote for a constitutional amendment to give women's suffrage in New York State. And that vote would be the general election November 6, 1917. And the sides were drawn, but you sense that there is the tide of opinion shifting more towards women's suffrage. The contribution of women to the war effort became a major argument promoting women's suffrage. If you look at this poster at the left, you'll see in the left column all of the things that women have done, and all they're asking in return is get the right to vote. The poster at the right is also emotional. It says, "We give our work, our men, our lives if need be. Will you give us the vote?" In this next frame, you see a streetcar poster that clearly linked World War I and women's suffrage. I draw your attention to the Union label, which appears just to the right of the red-lettered women's suffrage. Union support was crucially helpful in this effort to secure women's suffrage. Another factor, President Wilson changed his position and became a proponent of women's suffrage. In the efforts to secure approval of the voters in the 1917 referendum, there were some interesting developments. Note this banner that women were like lunatics and criminals in being denied suffrage. Here you see a commonly used poster for the 1917 referendum. There were emotional arguments on both sides prior to Election Day on November 6, 1917. At the left, you see the anti-suffragist argument, the fear that the women will leave all of the care of the children in the household to the men. At the right, you see one poster, "If women have the right to vote in Wyoming, Idaho, Colorado, Utah, Washington, California, why not in New York?" At the upper right, you're saying President Wilson says this is the time for women's suffrage. In this slide, you see a portion of another poster that was used in Cayuga County. Over 1 million New York State women ask you to vote yes on Women's Suffrage Amendment 1. Going on, the poster at left shows the Liberty Bell. and how it's being used to promote the idea of women's suffrage. Upper right poster appears to have been used in the unsuccessful 1915 referendum, and then again in 1917. Note carefully how the 7 of 1917 appears to be a paste over of what was probably a 5 for 1915. The second time, November 6, 1917, was the charm. The woman's suffrage to the New York State Constitution, the Woman's Suffrage Amendment, was approved. The biggest support came in the New York City area. And there were several factors. Here again, if you look back at this poster, you'll see the paste over of the 7 apparently over the 5. Now, there were several reasons to explain this victory. Listed are some of those factors. These factors include funding that the estate of Mrs. Frank Lester left to Carrie Chapman Catt, and she used those funds partially for the New York State campaign. Another factor, it wasn't a presidential election year, so there was a lower voter turnout, helping the dedicated pro-suffragist voters to become the majority. And of course, World War I was a major factor. Going on, if you look at this map of the states in terms of women's suffrage prior to ratification of the 19th Amendment in August 1920, you will easily see how several Western states have granted full suffrage to women, but not so to states east of the Mississippi, although partial suffrage is coming. Of course, New York State has granted full suffrage to women, and that made it almost inevitable that everywhere in the United States women would get the right to vote. Finally, on June 4th, 1919, the United States Congress formally proposed a constitutional amendment to guarantee women's suffrage everywhere in the United States. Several states jockeyed to be the first states to ratify this proposed 19th Amendment. Carrie Chapman Catt got Governor Alfred E. Smith to call a special session of the New York State Legislature to ratify as early as possible. On June 10th, the New York State Legislature ratified, and New York was the 6th state to ratify this proposed suffrage amendment. Finally, on August 18th, 1920, the necessary last state to ratify, Tennessee, ratified the 19th Amendment, but by only a margin of just 1 vote in the Tennessee State Senate. Shown here is a listing of the state-by-state success, be it partial suffrage or full suffrage. The woman's suffrage effort was, in a sense, a piece-by-piece kind of struggle. Rhoda Palmer, shown at left of the two ladies, is the only signer of the Declaration of Sentiments in 1848 in Seneca Falls that was still alive in 1919 when the 19th Amendment was ratified. Charlotte Pierce is reported in various sources as the person who traveled the furthest to attend the 1848 Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls. She was living in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1917 and 18, so she couldn't vote when New York State first granted full suffrage to women because she wasn't living in New York. She could have, however, voted in 1920 because of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. But she was too ill to vote on Election Day. So we are celebrating the centennial of full woman suffrage in New York State, and it truly is a cause for celebration. Earlier this month of November 2017, a special exhibit opened in the State Museum in Albany. I am going on the bus trip from the Geneva Historical Society on December 4th to see this special exhibit and also the one on New York and World War I. You can purchase a copy of the book that is the companion to this special exhibit on securing full woman suffrage for women in New York State. I hope you have enjoyed this program, which has traced the history of securing full suffrage for women in New York State, a movement that had a major start, in Seneca Falls in 1848 and is in a very important part of our Finger Lakes history.